Good morning and welcome to CSIS. We have a larger than anticipated crowd this morning, which I'm delighted to say is a good problem to have in the think tank business. So thanks to all of you for being here today. For those of you who are outside the room waiting for a chair, they're arriving as we speak.
We're starting, but we don't have sound.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. This is an adventure because of the video link.
Because I'm supposed to be. No, it was all set. We heard fine.
Okay, we're going to try to get this started. In any case, good morning and welcome. We also want to welcome our online audience today to CSIS. My name is Scott Miller. I'm hold the William M. Scholl Chair in International Business, and I'm pleased to welcome you to CSIS, and along with the colleagues we are presenting this event with. The CSIS Americas Program is a partner on this event, as you'll see in a moment, and we are partnered with the National Foreign Trade Council. Those of you who are not familiar with the NFTC, since 1914, the NFTC has represented globally engaged American companies in support of the rules-based global economy. The members of the World Trade Organization agreed to conduct its ministerial conference, in fact the 11th ministerial conference, in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in December 10th through 13th. Today's event seeks to preview the issues that WTO members will address in Buenos Aires, and also to reflect on the issues facing the organization and the future agenda for the rules-based trading system. I want to thank you all for being here, and we're delighted to begin the program with that preview of events from Buenos Aires, and the webcast will be coming from Buenos Aires. My colleague, Michael Matera, Director of the Americas Program at CSIS, will begin today with an interview of Mr. Miguel Brown, Minister of Commerce for the government of Argentina. Michael.
Scott, I'd like to welcome everyone here in Buenos Aires and also the audience in Washington. I'm Mike Matera. This is one of the first events of this sort with an audience in two cities that we've done, two cities on the two distinct ends of the Western Hemisphere. CSIS has been very busy over these last 18 months working on building stronger political and public-private links between the United States and Argentina. A year ago in Washington, almost exactly a year ago in Washington, we presented publicly our initiative, the Argentina-U.S. Strategic Forum. And for that, we had the Minister of Production, we had the Trade Secretary, Miguel Brown, and the Undersecretary, Junco Rojas, with us in D.C. 6 months ago, we had President Macri in Washington. He came to CSIS for a public presentation just after his meetings at the White House with President Trump. That was an event for which we had a live audience and an online audience of over 8,000 people. 1 month from today, as Scott said, Argentina is going to be hosting the 11th ministerial of the WTO. And hosting that is going to be Argentina's Trade Secretary, Miguel Brown. Miguel has a very distinguished career in both the public and the private sector. He is an economist by training, did his bachelor's degree at San Andres University here, and his master's and doctorate in economics from Harvard University. He has been Trade Secretary already for 2 years. In the period of time before he took over as Trade Secretary at the beginning of the Macri administration, he was the executive director of the think tank Pensar, which was the think tank in Argentina that brought together the technical experts who were working on the package of policy reforms that have been implemented, are being implemented over these first years of the Macri administration. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Miguel.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Mike. Good morning to everybody. Here we go. Oops. So we're very excited to be hosting the Okay, can you hear me now? We're very excited to be hosting the MC11 conference in Buenos Aires. This is especially important for Argentina right now because we have embarked on a clear course of reinserting our country into the global economy. And President Macri has stated that being fully integrated, being able to trade, being able to have clear investment flows is a cornerstone of his government. And in this sense, he has received over the past couple of years visits from the previous US president. He has visited the White House in the current, during the current government. He's received visits from the leaders of France, Italy, Japan, and several other countries, and this is showing that Argentina is really working hard to reinsert itself into the global economy. Now, since Argentina is a small country, clear trading rules are very important. In general, a rules-based international system is very important for Argentina and for all other small trading countries in the world. And that is the reason why we are especially proud to be hosting the WTO conference, and why we believe that there is a lot of at stake in preserving the global trading system and, of course, improving it in what needs to be improved. And we think that the current discussions that are taking place in the United States, in Europe, and in other countries around the world are an opportunity that we should take in the WTO conference to discuss how we can improve the global trading system. As I mentioned, Argentina has embarked on a very ambitious reform program led by President Macri. In the past couple of years, we first of all normalized the economy. We eliminated barriers to trade, barriers to the exchange rate. We resolved the situation of default that Argentina was in with the holdout bondholders, etc. We have advanced in several areas of deregulation and lowering costs across the economy. And this process of normalization has led, over the past couple of years, in a reduction of inflation, which has fallen to half of this year, half of what it was last year, and the central bank aims at it being half of what it was this year in the next year. That's the inflation target that the central bank is placing. We have presented a very ambitious fiscal stabilization and normalization program that aims at having zero primary deficit by 2020. And this has been accompanied by a very ambitious tax reform proposal that the government will be sending to Congress probably this week. The president has also issued a couple of very important decrees last week, ordering the debureaucratization of the administration in general, and this will be followed by several decrees between now and the next couple of months, where we will dramatically aim to simplify several aspects of the bureaucracy across the country. For example, now you can create a company in 24 hours in Argentina. Before it took several months. Now you can pretty much present the papers online and you can be working in 24 hours. And that's the kind of debureaucratization we're aiming at, to make it easy for companies to do business in Argentina. And of course, this program, which first has aimed at normalizing the macroeconomy, second is aiming at underpinning the structural fundamentals such as tax reform, lowering inflation, etc. And third, will aim at fully integrating Argentina into the global economy, is accompanied by an ambitious negotiation program. We are currently, with our Mercosur partners, negotiating a preferential trade agreement with the European Union. We aim at signing an investment treaty with Japan, hopefully by the end of this year, and if not, early next year. We have signed new trade deals with Colombia and Chile. We have deepened the trading relationship within Mercosur. by signing an investment treaty within Mercosur and hopefully a public procurement agreement by the end of this year. And we are in the midst of negotiations with Mexico and opening conversations with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So we have, as I mentioned, a very ambitious negotiation agenda that aims at integrating Argentina into the global economy. This negotiation agenda in foreign trade has two other pillars, one which is trade simplification. We have something that's called the single window for foreign trade that aims at putting all the import and export procedures online and making it much simpler and quicker for exporters and importers. And third, we have an ambitious program of export promotion. The Argentine Agency for Investment and Trade has an ambitious agenda of helping especially small and medium enterprises to export more, and this is a very important part of our government agenda. So within this context, we hope to host a successful ministerial conference in December. We understand that the context is complex, but as I said, we believe it's an opportunity not only to reaffirm that there are several issues from the Doha round, including agricultural issues that would be very positive if we can move forward on, but also new issues such as dealing with challenges for small and medium enterprises, dealing with electronic commerce, and dealing with investment facilitation that are opportunities that we could discuss in this ministerial. So we are very excited. We are definitely sure that the coffee is going to be good, that there's going to be nice little things to eat in the meetings. So the delegates are going to be happy in that sense, and Argentina is going to put all its best efforts as host to facilitate a constructive discussion that leads towards moving forwards in sustaining and improving the global trading system. So at the same time, let me mention two more things. We're going to be holding a very important business conference. It's the first time that the WTO holds a parallel business conference where we have several global CEOs that are going to be participating, and we believe this is an opportunity for the private sector to reaffirm its commitment to the multilateral trading system. And we're also going to have a very important academic event, a Think conference with think tanks, universities, experts, etc., that are also going to be discussing some of these issues. So, we're optimistic. As I said, we understand it's a complex scenario, but Argentina is committed to the multilateral trading system, and we're going to do our best to have a constructive MC11 in Buenos Aires in December. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Miguel. That was very helpful. We have now about 10 minutes for a brief conversation, and we'll take a few questions from the audience after I ask a few questions. You in very summary form talked about the agenda for MC11. Could you talk in a bit more detail about what you're expecting in terms of actual results coming out of the... Will there be progress on some of the new areas, digital trade, what's happening with fisheries subsidies, where we understand there's been quite a bit of discussion, and what other new agenda items do you see on the table?
Well, we're optimistic that those issues that you mentioned, some issues on agriculture, SMEs, electronic commerce, trade facilitation, fisheries, etc., could be on the agenda. And once again, we're going to do everything possible to facilitate a constructive discussion on these issues, but we cannot guarantee that we're going to have a positive result. I mean, there are many opposing views on several of these issues. Some members that claim that we don't have a mandate to advance on some of these areas. Other countries that say that unless we advance with some of the pending issues from the Doha round, then they're not willing to open new discussions. So it's a very challenging environment. As I said, we're optimistic that we're going to be able to talk about these things, but it's very hard to predict a positive or specific positive outcome on one of these areas. I don't know, Shunko, if you want to add something.
No, this is I mean, as you mentioned in your comments, a particularly challenging period of time. Protectionism is resurgent in various parts of the world, principally in my own country. You're going into a negotiation where some people are questioning the relevance of the WTO as a multilateral institution. I'm wondering if you can address that issue a little bit. The Director General of the WTO himself, Mr. Acevedo, a few weeks ago, was calling for flexibility and pragmatism. It sounds as if there are a lot of doubts as to where this session is going to go. This has got to be a challenging situation to be facing as the host of MC11. Could you comment a bit on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, once again, the host has responsibility for the logistics going well and, you know, facilitating the discussion. But the WTO is a member-driven organization. Each country has a vote. Everybody's opinion is important, and we don't have a special possibility of, you know, really going against the opinion of the majority of the countries. So really, I mean, I think it depends a lot on the possibility of getting an agreement on some of these areas. But once again, as you said, we're in a challenging time. There are many protectionist and populist resurgencies around the world, many countries that are questioning the role of the WTO. Of course, that is not the position of the Argentine government. As I mentioned, I mean, for Argentina, a multilateral rules-based trading system is very important because we are a small country. We don't have the possibility of imposing our agenda on others. So clear rules and rules that are respected and a system to enforce those rules is very important for us. So we defend the WTO, the role of the WTO and other multilateral organizations. But having said that, rules need to be updated and need to be improved. So we are definitely open to have a discussion on improving those rules. But once again, we have one vote in that discussion, right? So, I mean, there's really not much more we can say until we have everybody here and we actually see what the different positions are.
Yeah. Argentina, for many years, was one of the most closed economies in the world. And you all, over the last 2 years, have really begun a reopening of the Argentine economy. Where does that leave Argentina at a time like this? Where does your destiny rest? Is it with an expanded TPP, like was talked about last week in Da Nang? Is it with an expanded Pacific Alliance? Is it with Mercosur? Where is Argentina? Where is Argentina today in this confusing period?
So definitely Argentina shows that protectionism and populism don't work. We received the government with over 30% of the population below the poverty line, with many years of stagnant growth, very low investment, high inflation, etc. So really that is not a constructive way to go. Of course, I think around the world, we're all worried about the impact of new technologies on the labor market. But I should warn about the risks of old technology. I mean, if your country has old technology, then for sure you're going to do much worse. I mean, that is not the way to go. So what Argentina is doing is really revamping and upgrading its technology, its infrastructure, its financial system, its tax system to really become more competitive. And hopefully we can integrate intelligently into global value chains with different countries. We have a lot going now in the deal between Mercosur and the European Union. We think that is a huge opportunity. We also believe that Argentina has to be much more fully integrated with the rest of Latin America. We believe that there we have a lot to win together by facilitating trade within Latin America. And in that sense, I mentioned some of the deals that we've signed with Colombia, with Chile. Mercosur and the Pacific Alliance are discussing trade facilitation, so we're moving in that direction. And once those deals move forward, then I think we're going to be in a position to really see what the next step is.
Okay. You were in Washington a couple of weeks ago for negotiations with the Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, on an issue that has come up in just the last few months, the issue of Argentina's exports of biodiesel to the United States. Can you tell us a bit about where that has all ended? We understand that duties were announced last week, just after President Macri left New York. And what are the next steps for Argentina in this case? Are you going to go to the WTO to challenge those duties?
Well, I mean, first of all, let me say we have a very constructive relationship with the U.S. that involves many issues. I mean, I don't want to expand my opinion beyond trade issues, but our collaboration with the U.S. involves issues in security, defense, etc. So, you know, we have a very constructive dialogue. But in trade issues, it is a bit disappointing. I mean, Argentina is disappointed on what happened with biodiesel because it is our main, or was our main export to the U.S. And we have shown a lot of flexibility in terms of facilitating the imports of some agricultural products that the U.S. was interested in facilitating to Argentina. We also have other issues on the agenda that we are asking the U.S. to facilitate. And really, you know, we see that this was a petition that came from the private sector that could have ended up with a more constructive win-win deal, and really the U.S. ended up with, I would say, maximum sanctions that Argentina believes are not according to international rules, because we've already won a case against the European Union in the WTO along these lines. So, of course, all the options are open. I mean, we do not discard the possibility of taking this to the WTO. So, basically, to sum up, I mean, we are disappointed with the result, but we have a broader and more constructive dialogue, and hopefully this is an opportunity to deepen the dialogue in commercial issues, for example, in the agricultural agenda we have in exporting Argentine products to the U.S. and vice versa.
Okay, no, great. Wonder if you could just spend a few minutes talking about the process. You all are hosting 159 trade ministers from around the world. There are 34 countries in the process of trying to become members. How is this process going to work here in Buenos Aires? How are you going to manage what must be a rather complex and challenging negotiation? Well, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the logistics and the organization is being led by our foreign ministry. There's an ambassador specifically allocated to lead and coordinate the whole government effort, and he's doing a fantastic job. And we have security, defense, the city of Buenos Aires. It's all over the place. There are many government institutions that are involved in this very significant logistical challenge. And then, of course, we have Susana Malcorra, who is the conference chair, and she will have the job, and she's already doing a fantastic job of really talking to all the member states and working with the WTO to try to facilitate the discussion. So, I think, once again, Argentina is interested in strengthening the WTO and having a successful conference. We've put our best people in making this happen. Once again, we're going to do our best. We are doing our best, but this doesn't guarantee that we're going to be successful in the end result in having a positive negotiation.
Okay, well, we wish you all the best. I'd like to turn to the floor now here in Buenos Aires. If there's a question or two, we would welcome a question for Miguel or for Junco Rojas, the Undersecretary for Foreign Trade.
Yes. What's the focus of the treaty with Mexico? What are you trying to... What's the focus of the treaty with Mexico and with Chile and with Peru? What are you trying to open, or is it overall opening of everything to commerce?
So with Mexico, Argentina already has a bilateral trade deal within the ALADI framework, and we're working on expanding and deepening that agreement in terms of including more products. Especially Argentina is more interested in exporting agricultural products to Mexico. And at the same time, in deepening the preferences that already exist in our bilateral trade. And at the same time, we are working to add modern chapters to our trade deal, which would include issues such as intellectual property, public procurement, electronic commerce, etc., other sort of 21st century disciplines to our bilateral deal. With Chile, we already had a very deep free trade agreement, and we've increased its scope somewhat. We've included an investment, we've modernized our investment treaty with Chile, we've deepened some preferences, we've worked on trade facilitation, so we're basically improving the agreements we already have.
We have time for one more question, if there is a question.
Hi, good morning. It's Fabian Dirsi from Novartis. And you just mentioned IP as an important chapter of your bilateral or multilateral discussions. And I'm wondering what are the Argentina government steps in order to reach the minimum standards, international standards on that area that are still a little bit behind.
Yeah, we are carrying out a number of reforms that cover several aspects of intellectual property. As you know, the INPI, our National Agency for Intellectual Property, our National Institute for Intellectual Property is implementing a reform program that addresses many of the pending issues, including modernization of the organization, professionalizing the staff, making the processes faster and simpler and less costly. We are also working on enforcement issues. As you know, Argentina, the government has taken a very strong position in the case of the La Salada, putting an end to one of the biggest illegal markets in Latin America. And we are also developing a work program in the framework of the TIFA agreement with the United States, the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement. We have created an innovation forum in which we discuss several issues related to intellectual property. We believe that we are making very good progress in this regard. We are receiving investments from pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies from around the world. And last year we have received announcements for over $70 million for companies in Argentina. And of course, there is many things to be done, but we believe we are on the right track.
Great. With that, we're going to turn the floor back to the audience and the panel in Washington. But before doing that, I'd like to thank very much the bank, BBVA Francés, which has offered us the use of their facilities today. Martin Zarich, the president, has been a full member of our strategic forum. He's not with us here today, but we'd like to thank him and the bank for the use of these facilities. So without further ado, Scott, we pass the word back to Washington.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Miguel, and all. We decided not to tempt fate further by having questions from this audience to Argentina. We're glad it worked as well as it did. Thank you very much. Now, if you wonder what you're doing at CSIS on a Monday morning, the answer is this is when we could get our keynote speaker. We built this program around Alan Wolf, and we're delighted he's here this morning. He's a good friend of CSIS over the years, but one of the legends in international trade among those of us in Washington. Ambassador Wolf began a long career in government service at the Treasury Department, working on these international issues at Treasury, but eventually became the Deputy Special Trade Representative in the Carter administration and General Counsel of USTR in the Ford administration. Following a successful career in government, he had an equally successful career in practicing law, where he became essentially the dean of the trade bar in Washington, D.C. He's always a delight to host here. He most recently was at the law firm Denton's and was chairman of the National Foreign Trade Council, but this summer he became one of the 4 deputy director generals of the WTO. He's passing through Washington, but we got him when we could, and we're delighted to welcome to the podium Alan Wolf.
Thank you very much. CSIS is a phenomenal place that does great work. One of its interests is, in fact, in fishery subsidies, which has geopolitical as well as economic aspects to it. And that's one of the subjects that is potential for resolution in Buenos Aires in a month. Heavily subsidized area. And one of the interesting aspects of it is this is not a north-south issue. This is an issue in which the United States and a number of developed countries are also on the same side as a number of developing countries who are the most seriously disadvantaged by factory ships that are heavily subsidized that come into the waters that are fished by local fishermen. And so it's an environmental issue. It's not a north-south issue. It is an important trade issue. So things are coming together in a different way than they have in the past. The U.S. is not entirely absent, I might say, from the fray. It has an interest in fisheries, not because it's a strong economic interest. It has joined with Uganda and Kenya to propose changes with respect to minimum pesticide residues. It sounds like sort of a technical thing, and it is technical, except for the fact that if you have the wrong standards for the shipment of grains, they don't ship, and that involves a lot of U.S. trade. The U.S. also has a proposal on transparency, on living up to the notification requirements and consultation requirements of the WTO, which are honored very often in the fact that they are not honored at all. They have become an exception. I start out with the U.S. because I'm here in Washington with a U.S. audience, but there's a lot going on that is not simply north-south. The e-commerce issue, which is of interest to a lot of folks here in this country, is refreshingly being driven by the ambassador of Pakistan, the ambassador of Costa Rica. It's not a north-south issue. Susanna Malcora, that the Minister Brown talked about, has been barnstorming around the world to capitals, trying to get folks to be very forthcoming in Buenos Aires. And it's not over till it's over. There's a lot yet to be done. But when I was acting head of delegation a long time ago during the Tokyo round, it took another 4 years after I was there during a period of doldrums, which are sort of normal in Geneva, to come to the conclusion of that negotiation. And there are folks here who are veterans who will remember that Carla Hills had outside her office a countdown calendar to Brussels 1990, the end of the Uruguay round, except for one thing, and that is it ended 4 years later in Geneva. So getting a lot done is time-consuming. It's a slow process, and patience is needed. My purpose today really is to focus on broader questions than simply MC11, although MC11 is very important. The ministerial conference in Buenos Aires is very important. It's motivated by President Trump, as many things are, including the news cycle every day here. I might say I bought a television a month ago in Geneva and haven't turned it on yet, and it's marvelous. I recommend it to you. President Trump, a little over 6 months ago, asked for a report within 6 months on trade agreements. And it's a reason why the WTO really needs your attention, because actually it has the President's attention. There are 4 things I want to cover today. The value of the WTO in very basic terms, the changes that are needed, secondly, the institution's leadership with the U.S. in a different position than it's been, and the place of bilateral negotiations, and where they can be used constructively and where they are used constructively. So first, evaluating what we have. The report that has reached the President's desk, and as far as I know is not public yet, but perhaps it's part of the Wednesday announcement that we hear is going to come from the White House from the President on trade, has the following elements. Assessments of Wilbur Ross and Bob Lighthizer on, 1, violations or abuses of any WTO rule governing any trade relation under the WTO harming American workers or domestic manufacturers, farmers, or ranchers, harming our intellectual property rights, reducing our rate of innovation, or impairing domestic research and development. 2, unfair treatment by trade and investment partners that is causing the above-mentioned harms. 3, shortfalls in predicted new jobs created, unfavorable effects on the trade balance, and not obtaining expanded market access, lowered trade barriers, or increased United States exports. And the USTR and the Secretary of Commerce are to recommend, and presumably did, lawful and appropriate actions to remedy or correct deficiencies identified. Now, in the remedial work I did for the taking the SATs a while back, I had to diagram sentences and learned that English had a certain structure. And it's interesting when you say lawful and appropriate actions to remedy. It's not lawful, comma, appropriate actions, or lawful appropriate actions. It's lawful and appropriate actions. So maybe the appropriate actions aren't always lawful. That's the way English works. Good and evil. You know, we'll recommend good and evil. Anyway, it's just an aside. Good luck to all of you. I believe it's of value to reflect on, it's of use to reflect on the current value of the WTO system. And what I did in preparation for these remarks, which are not clearly on behalf of the WTO, I've been there 2 months. I don't speak from a vast wealth of institutional knowledge within that building. It comes from being outside that building, occasionally not actually demonstrating in the streets, but in Seattle and Cancun and elsewhere during ministerials. But I asked ambassadors, well, what do you see as the value of the WTO? And a number of small countries said to me, it's a safety net. But it's not only for small countries. If NAFTA goes down or Brexit goes to a hard Brexit, actually what happens is the WTO is there, and that's vitally important. In 2008, one reason we did not have a depression and just had a deep recession is because the WTO was there. And what are the 4 things I see as the foundation elements that were vitally important are that the tariffs are bound, can't be raised without paying a price for it, that quotas can't be imposed without paying a price for it, retaliation, paying compensation, that most favored nation treatment, you can't discriminate, and national treatment, you can't discriminate between nationals and imports. So it's 4 things. I'm sure there are others. There are a lot of rules, but those 4 things kept us from sliding potentially over a brink into an abyss. The WTO, without the WTO, we tend to slip into an unhealthy form of regionalism. It is not what we did. We being, the word we is perhaps the wrong pronoun, but the West, Roosevelt and Churchill, in meeting in Placentia Bay for the Atlantic Charter in 1942, they had a vision that all countries would be able to trade freely and on an equal basis. And that is what's been driving the world since. They had a choice after World War II. They could have gone back to imperial preferences. They could have carved up the world, but they didn't. The U.S. led an effort at an MFN, most favored nation basis, moving forward. One of the major critics of a trade minister, whom you know, has said, a major critic of the WTO, if the WTO didn't exist, it would have to be created. That's an important point. What we have is vital. Now, it's not just the recession that tests the WTO. Every day, governments promulgate hundreds of regulations around the world, tens of thousands of regulations, and either those restrict trade or they don't. And to a large extent, when there's a black letter rule in place, they do not restrict trade. They can. There's always a testing of the system, but countries generally do not cross black letter rules, the lines that are drawn, whether it's because they fear retribution or because they think it's the right thing to do, and in their self-interest, they don't do it. I see there are three functions of the WTO. Others of you who are very expert in this area will see others, perhaps. But implementation of the existing rules, number one, settlement of trade disputes, number two, and the negotiation of new rules. On implementation, the work of the WTO gets doesn't make headlines. The areas they happen to report to my cone of responsibility, but standards and sanitary and phytosanitary standards, so both product standards of industrial goods and of agriculture. Over 90% of world trade is governed by standards. A standard changes, there can be no trade at all. It's what happened for a large segment of the wind energy market in China, for example. Change the standard for procurement, and maybe nobody makes that product and doesn't come in wind generating equipment. So it's vitally important. It is also numbingly boring. My first trip to Geneva for the U.S. government, I was at Treasury, and I was to explain why a certain tax proposal to remedy the imbalance between the types of tax systems that exist in the world, between those who have a value-added tax and ourselves that have our own system of taxation depending on income taxes. I was to explain why this was legitimate under the GATT rules. It wasn't, therefore I made no converts. It was a room like this, about 100 people and different countries, and sold nobody. But my boss said, while you're there, it's only 3 weeks, there's a standards committee meeting, standards negotiation, why don't you sit in on that? Well, I learned how to drink heavily at night. I didn't really enjoy cognac a lot before that. The value of the WTO is demonstrated by the accessions process, another division that reports to me. These are countries that are largely deeply troubled. After all, 164 countries are already in. There are some 31 that came in recently. There's another 26 or so that are in the accession process. They are countries like Bosnia and Herzegovina, a place that until recently suffered, as you know from the Dayton Accords, severe problems. One of the last countries in, the next to last country in, was Liberia. It had a civil war followed by Ebola, devastated economy. Why did they want to come in to the WTO? Because it reformed their economy. They were able to recover better. They could attract investment. It gave them some stability. Who else is, I was on a program in September with representatives of Somalia and Sudan. Difficult places in terms of their current situation. The last member to join last year, 164th member of the WTO, was Afghanistan, a troubled place. These are countries desperate to get in to reform their economies. A week and a half ago, I met with the Prime Minister of Belarus. They would like to engage in integration into the world economy. And the accession process can be very long. began 12 years ago, but they've reinvigorated the process. They could come in within a couple of years. So the fact is, countries that are on the outside desperately see the value of being in, it's an exciting process to meet with them and talk with them. And I think it will contribute to the vibrancy of the organization. Second area, dispute settlement, which has received some notoriety in this capital. U.S. has been very unhappy with dispute settlement in the WTO for quite a while. It is considered by academics as the jewel of the system. The United States say, well, there are flaws in that jewel. And there's a question of what is going to happen going forward. The European Union, in its wisdom, had said when a seat came up for the Latin and a seat was going to come up for European, we're not going to allow you to take in a Latin before you take in a European. We're going to package that. The U.S. came along and said, see you and raise you one. The Korean trade minister resigned, Korean trade member resigned and went to be trade minister. And so the U.S. said, well, wait a minute. Before there is reform, institutional reform of the system, and it gave as an example that the appellate body had set its own rule with respect to how long a member could sign decisions after that member's term had expired. If you were sitting on a case and your term expires, can you still sign that decision? And the U.S. said that's a decision for members to take, whether that authority exists, not a decision for appellate body members. Currently there is an impasse. Another seat becomes empty September of next year. The question is, does the appellate system seize up? And what happens if that happens? Well, let's say the United States brings a case against China, something we do from time to time in this country. I can't say we anymore. You people in the United States. I'm a colorless bureaucrat resident in Geneva. You bring a case against China, you win. Horticultural barriers of some sort, whatever it is. And it's important to the United States. You win. China says, we're going to appeal. U.S. says, no, we'd really like you to open up your market. You're doing things that we just can't tolerate. China says, but we got an appeal pending. The Chinese say, but you blocked membership in the appellate body, so actually there's a line of cases at the door, we can't get an appeal. So the U.S. says, well, oddly enough, we got this unilateral authority, we're going to sock you on in terms of trade, a technical term that will be revived before too long here. The Chinese say, well, wait a minute, we're going to cross-retaliate, we're going to retaliate back. And the U.S. says, well, wait a moment, we have a problem with your original barrier. Before you know it, the Archduke of Austria has been assassinated, and things get out of control. No one liked him, by the way, anyway. He was a minor figure. He didn't matter, but it did trigger some problems. So what's happening? Countries are actually thinking, member countries are actually thinking about, some of them, how the system might be reformed that would be broadly acceptable. Would it be acceptable to the U.S.? No one knows. Right now, the problem is that the appellate body is going to become dysfunctional. I said to the Chinese member of the appellate body, in the year 2020, you're all alone, you get to decide all the cases. She was not amused. So the agenda going forward, implementation of the current rules clearly needs to be part of it. There are areas where trade disciplines don't really exist very well, like domestic subsidies. very little on the agricultural side, nothing adequate, and not at all, really nothing with respect to industrial domestic subsidies that's worth much of anything. And the WTO has to adapt to fill in gaps, and it has done so to a fair degree. The vast super containers carry enormous amounts of goods, putting stress on customs facilities. The trade facilitation agreement actually helps with respect to the expanding volumes of world trade. It is said to be the equivalent of the removal of a 14% tariff, 14% burden on trade. Since average tariffs of all countries are 8% on goods, that's, you know, a 14% elimination of a burden. That's quite something. The information technology agreement expansion that was just agreed in Nairobi is a very forward-looking kind of thing. It's up for renewal, review, I should say, in 2018. It's important that it stay at the cutting edge. There are a lot of areas, including services and intellectual property, that have been very good and require additional attention. World commercial services are $4.8 trillion a year. The ITA covers $13 trillion a year. These are areas that require updating. What kind of questions can occur in the future that the WTO is not very well prepared to deal with, potentially? Where's the cloud? What country is it in? Is it when you get something down from the cloud, have you gotten it from one over, you know, it's like the ozone layer, a hole in the ozone layer. Did you get it over, you know, all over Australia or servers? Where were those servers? Did they switch back and forth, as Hedy Lamar's invention helped create, if you've been reading your Smithsonian lately? What's the treatment for products that are 3D printed? Where's the value? How do you treat that cross-border activity? How about from space? SpaceX is going up there, and there'll be commercial manufacturing up there. What happens when there's remote diagnosis by a specialist physician in one country that is beamed into another country for consultation purposes? Or a holographic teacher comes to teach you, in my case, French. Actually, it's a nice lady who lives just in Lyon, which is about, you know, half hour away. But, you know, how do you treat these things? This is the era of data, the flow of data across borders. And there are countries that say, we want to preserve our policy space. That means we want to be able to protect what we want to protect. Well, do you build an Iron Dome? Get the Israelis to help you with that, to prevent you from these signals that are coming from all over the globe, to prevent you from economic development, possibly. Airplane engines now have 100 sensors in them to report back not just to people at the manufacturing location, but to the robots on the assembly line to improve the functioning of the future airplane engines. Again, it's a data flow issue. There are now smart bolts, which I hope to aspire to be one at the WTO. What it is a bolt that goes into something like a bridge, a structure, and it reports back when the stresses are getting too great, and the bridge might fail. And to whom does it report? Just to the nation? Just to the manufacturer? So the world is becoming extraordinarily complex, and the WTO has to be adapted to deal with trade in a data-driven industrial revolution. WTO members will have to be very nimble to keep up with that, and that is not the way the WTO has functioned. It's not the nature of the evolution of the trading system. lawlessness, which is a nasty way of saying lack of regulation, has been very, very favorable for the development of the digital world so far, when it means no regulation. But that regulation is coming, and the question is, will there be international rules to create the right balance? Leadership, a third element. The United States is on the bench. It is not leading. It does have some interests, but this is a different 70 years of U.S. leadership, and it's just stopped doing it. So I say to other countries, step up. China, European Union, Japan. Japan was phenomenal in TPP. It engaged, it was thoroughly involved in setting rules, working with the United States and Australia and others, the former New Zealand, before the election. And it was willing to engage on agriculture. This is very different than the Japan that was in the Uruguay round, where the negotiators were largely in hiding because someone might say rice. It's a different dynamic. Has that shown up in Geneva? I don't think so. And polling ambassadors, and since I see prominent representatives of the European Union amongst us, they would say, I say, has the EU changed? Has China changed? Has Japan changed? To pick up the fallen banner that the U.S. left behind, they say no, hasn't changed, and it's got to. Well, my hope is, actually, it could be collective leadership. I think no country is too small Lee Kuan Yew punched above his weight. There were WTO ambassadors from small countries like Jamaica that had an outsized influence. They can do more, but the best solution would be the United States comes back, maybe in 2018. That depends a lot on the people in this room and others like you as to whether you actually give voice to the fact that the United States has to play. The other point I wanted to make is the role of bilaterals. Basically, a lot of negotiations on market access are primarily bilateral. In TPP, there was a core negotiation between the U.S. and Japan covering things like rules of origin on auto parts and the like that was central to getting TPP together. The Environmental Goods Agreement, 3 words not heard in Geneva as far as I know at all now. The U.S. was a major proponent. The U.S. isn't a major proponent of anything now, is basically 2 bilaterals. It's a bilateral for the U.S. It's a bilateral with Europe, and it's a bilateral with Japan, with China. So I would say to this administration, think about your bilaterals. They still play a major role in the world. Mr. Trump, you're not entirely wrong when it comes to the importance of bilateral negotiations on things like market access. But then, how do you implement them? You implement by collecting other folks' bilaterals, and you put them together, you package them. It's called a multilateral agreement. But it's based on bilaterals. So it ought not to be shunned. If you're a developer, you might strike a deal to build your particular hotel or whatever it is, but if you're going to build a city, you actually have a lot of other participants that are necessary to build that city. So actually, for a giant deal, a really colossal deal, you need to do it on a multi-party basis. Will enforcement be a problem? Of course, enforcement will always be a problem with a bilateral and with a multilateral agreement. So bottom line, the multilateral approach is the best path forward. Ultimately, it's built on bilaterals. It has to be made to work. Rules aren't practical on a bilateral basis. They have to be multilateral. I know that tax is a dominant issue now in this town. I know that after that, NAFTA and Chorus, get principal attention, but I think it would be a costly error to ignore the WTO, take it for granted. It's our heritage. It's what was bequeathed to us by generations of American leaders, by some negotiators in this room, dating back to Cordell Hull. I don't. I want to clarify that for the record. Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, although one of my first negotiations at USTR, the first negotiation at USTR, was the entrance of Britain into the European community at the time. So that sort of dates me in terms of now Brexit taking place. It's important for the WTO to be valued, maintained, continually improved, and updated to meet new challenges. And I'm optimistic that our generation can do exactly that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. I'm rather than attempting a impression of Steve Harvey here, I just am unfamiliar with conferences that have a full front row. So thank you all for coming. We're going to switch to the panel discussion now. And Ambassador Wolf, thank you again for your remarks.
Okay. And Elizabeth is up there.
Straight. Can we leave this stuff at the back? Hi, Dorothy.
Be cutting off from the panel discussion up in Washington. They're going to be focused more on
Well, I guess we're cutting off from them too. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for sticking with us for the final portion of the program. I'm Jake Colvin with the National Foreign Trade Council and its Global Innovation Forum. First of all, I just wanted to thank Ambassador Wolf for not sugarcoating the situation in Geneva right now and for giving us kind of an on-the-ground view of what's going on and what's to come. We wanted to pick up on a couple of the points that he raised, I think. But first, also want to thank Scott Miller and CSIS for hosting this event. I think even more timely than we thought it was going to be when we put this on, when we planned this a couple of weeks ago. Given the news coming out of APEC in Asia over the weekend about the TPP-11 and also President Trump's comments about the World Trade Organization. So I was going to start with a question about prospects for the ministerial, but I feel like that might be burying the lead. And so wanted to start instead by picking up on a theme that Ambassador Wolf had talked about, which is the value of the World Trade Organization and the future of the global trading system. And I was going to start by turning to Elizabeth Bowes, who's the Minister Counselor for Trade at the Embassy of Australia, but she also was previously posted as a counselor to Australia's permanent mission to the World Trade Organization, which I think gives you even more credibility for the discussion here today. And wanted to say, first of all, congratulations on an important step forward for Australia and the rest of the TPP-11 countries in Asia over the weekend. And so I think you have this contrast of the TPP-11 moving forward versus the World Trade Organization and some of the complexities and roadblocks that seem to be emerging there. And so given that progress that was announced on TPP over the weekend, what do you see as Australia's role in the global trading system right now, and what is the role of the WTO in that?
Thank you very much, Jake, and thank you also to CSIS and NFTC for putting on this important event at a very timely event, I might say, as well, both following APEC and the announcement in Da Nang on TPP, but also in the lead up to MC11. So Australia has always been a strong supporter of, contributor to, and beneficiary of the global trading system. We were a founding member of the GATT, like the United States, and we were also a founding member of the successor organisation, the WTO. And we've always advocated, and it's interesting, this is a point that Minister Brown mentioned at the beginning, as a relatively small country, we've advocated for the benefit of a secure, transparent, rules-based trading system that basically ensures a level playing field for large and small players alike, and ensures that large players cannot act in an arbitrary manner towards smaller players. Now, while we're a relatively small economy, I think Australians always like to think of themselves as punching above their weight. And so we've always been active in GATT and, of course, WTO negotiations, both in the Uruguay round, bringing the WTO to fruition, and in subsequent rounds. We see the WTO as being at the core of the global trading system, and it is that global trading system that has ensured global economic prosperity and peace since the end of the Second World War, and which, of course, has been led very ably by the United States, and in fact driven by the United States. Australia itself has benefited in large part from our participation in this global trading system. We've had 26 years of uninterrupted economic growth. That's in large part due to our commitment to domestic economic reform, but also to trade liberalisation. But we've also seen that replicated and expanded in our region in the Indo-Pacific, as that region has become more and more prosperous as it's adhered to the global rules-based system. We've seen the benefits of belonging in a secure rules-based structure, that the benefits that brings. So with the withdrawal of the United States from the TPP, with which we were disappointed, of course, our Prime Minister and our government decided, with Japanese government and others, that there was still benefit to be gained from driving the process forward. For us, the TPP was not so much about market access, although there were market access gains. It was very much about the standards and rules that the TPP set for an ever-increasingly prosperous and dynamic region in the Asia-Pacific. And so we saw value in continuing with that endeavour to ensure that increasing prosperity and dynamism. So we're very pleased to announce, or to have the TPP 11 ministers announce an agreement on core principles for what will be a new agreement, which is a comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. Still getting used to the name. And that will incorporate the provisions of the TPP with some provisions, not a huge number, but some provisions to be suspended, and 4 areas still to be finalised and on which consensus is to be achieved in order for signature and for finalisation of that package, and we hope that will happen very soon. But certainly we believe, and the Prime Minister made this point in a speech that he delivered prior to APEC, that TPP and other arrangements that we're entering into the region, such as RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, will help ensure bringing the region together. And that's so important for underlining peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. But we don't forget the WTO. As I said, we've always been a strong supporter. The WTO remains central to our own system. It is always the starting point for our negotiations. We prefer agreements that are WTO plus, not WTO minus, and we will continue to be an active player both multilaterally as well as regionally and bilaterally. Evolving, I think we're becoming perhaps a defender of the system as well as a supporter, and I think that's an increasingly important role to play. We will continue to call for open markets, a rules-based multilateral trading system, and to protect and reject protectionism.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I wanted to turn next to the 2 business representatives on our panel and start with Ambassador Rufus Yerxa, who's president of the National Foreign Trade Council and a former Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. So last year, President Trump told Chuck Todd that the World Trade Organization was a disaster. And he followed that up last week by saying in Vietnam that the United States has not been treated fairly by the World Trade Organization. And so I'm curious what you think about that, and if you could talk a little bit about the value of the World Trade Organization to American businesses and workers.
Thank you, Jake. Yes, and first of all, thanks to Scott Miller and his team at CSIS for putting this on. You know, I was very happy to hear what I thought very insightful comments of my former chairman at NFTC and also successor in my former job in Geneva, Alan apparently was happy with everything about the job except the furniture that I procured for his now his office. But I'm sure he'll forgive me, and he'll probably get some different ones. But there's a lot of value to what he said. Thinking on his comment about the number of countries, first of all, the 164 members that have flooded in to be part of the WTO, but even more countries with trouble and needs to reform their system joining. It reminds me, well, at the same time, the U.S. seems to be talking down the WTO. You just mentioned the comments of President Trump. Reminds me a little bit of the old Yogi Berra line, when after Yogi retired from baseball, he was asked if he ever went back to his favorite restaurant in New York, Shores Restaurant, which he used to hang around in with Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris and all, and he said, no, nobody goes there anymore, it's too crowded. That seems to be, in a way, the U.S. approach to the WTO. I see Peter Allgeier in the office. He's worked with me at USTR and is a former ambassador in Geneva when I was there. If you had told Peter a few years ago that the U.S. would be talking down the WTO, well, Argentina would be talking it up, he'd find it pretty incredible. But let me just talk for a minute. I'd like to make a couple of points about, first of all, the value of the system to the U.S., and secondly, some of the consequences of us beginning to, shall we say, cede leadership or lose interest in the organization. First of all, a lot of points have been made about why it's the foundation of rules that is assumed by everybody to be a basis for the system. Alan talked about this. Obviously, concepts like national treatment, which if you took it away from the global economy would truly create chaos, let alone the commitments that people make on their tariff systems and to non-discrimination. And then a whole range of rules in all kinds of areas that people just don't think about, like import licensing and customs valuation. And Alan mentioned standards and things like food safety and other issues. So those are just kind of baked into the existing global system, and everybody assumes that they're there. They're not there if major players start walking away from the WTO. That's the first thing. The second thing is, still a huge amount of U.S. trade covered only by WTO rules. We like to talk about how important our FTAs are to us, but let's remember, many of the biggest trading relationships, the U.S. has, depend entirely on WTO rules. Of our top 10 trading partners, 7 of them have no FTA relationship. So, and that includes Europe, China, Japan, and who knows, maybe in a little while it might include Canada and Mexico, the way things are going. But, I might throw in Korea, at which point it would be 10 of the 10. So it's still very important as a framework of rules. The other thing is, all this talk about the dispute settlement system working against U.S. interests. Actually, if you look at the facts, the U.S. has been an enormously successful complainant. We bring more complaints than any other country, and we have a very high success rate. And even on the losing side, our loss ratio isn't really out of whack with other major players. In fact, if we hadn't sort of forced the WTO dispute settlement system to increase our loss rate by repeated rulings against us on an issue like zeroing, instead of changing our laws the first time we lost, we'd have a much better success rate on the defendant side. So the second thing is the dispute settlement process has obviously been very fair to us. Then I get to the question of leadership and what happens if the U.S. cedes that leadership. There's a lot of other things going on here that I have trouble with from a geostrategic point of view with where the U.S. is going on trade policy. The withdrawal from TPP, the toughening of NAFTA, really an administration that seems to be trying to work it towards a more restrictive rather than a more expansive system, and the proliferation of unilateral measures. Alan had mentioned some indication of that. Minister Braun had mentioned some indication of that with respect to biodiesel, but you look at other areas where the U.S. administration is talking about taking unilateral restrictions. The sum total of all of that is going to be a signal that the U.S. is moving in reverse on trade just at a time when the rest of the world is moving in fast forward. If you look at the TPP announcement, if you look at Europe's deal with Canada, deepening their deal with Mexico, an EU-Mercosur deal, Japan and Canada and Mexico all going to be in it together in TPP, and in TPP. And like I say, we could actually see a situation a year from now when Europeans and Asians have preferential duty-free access to Canada and Mexico, and the United States exporters don't. So all of this is a big disaster, but one of the biggest disasters would be our no longer really being seen as leading and engaging in the WTO system, because that would certainly put China in the driver's seat of global negotiations. They would become the force to be reckoned with as we try to reshape the system in areas like digital commerce and the whole field of innovation that the U.S. has to be leading in if we want the right kinds of rules.
Thank you, Rufus. So next I wanted to turn to Sarah Thorne, who's Senior Director for Global Government Affairs at Walmart. She's also chair of NFTC's WTO Working Group, and she was in Vietnam and I think heard President Trump's remarks directly. And so could you talk a little bit about the value of the World Trade Organization to a company like Walmart?
Sure, and thanks. It's wonderful to be here, and it's also wonderful to go after these two wonderful gentlemen. I'll try to put some color. I agree so much with the remarks that have been said before me about the importance of the WTO system. For a company like Walmart, the rules matter. I think we've sort of taken for granted what trade means to us, because we've sort of baked it in, as Rufus has said, into our daily operations. We're a $500+ billion company. We have operations in 28 markets. We source from a number of other countries. For us, trade is about getting the right product to our customers wherever they are at a price they can afford. And trade's actually about getting the friction out of the system. And the rules are about setting the right kind of norms to essentially get governments out so markets can operate. If I think about tariffs, I think about them as taxes. And if I think about the US tariff system, I think the best middle tax cut you could get would be to get rid of the remaining tariffs we have on things like food and clothing, which are the highest tariffs we have, which disproportionately affect my customers. That's what trade means to Walmart. It means fruits and vegetables all year round for my customers, wherever they are. And it means helping US suppliers have access to our markets overseas. And we just sort of understand that now as part of the norms, and thinking about how much trade crosses our borders without even thinking about what would happen if we tried to undo everything. The way our business is changing, we're no longer just a brick and mortar retailer. We're an omni-channel retailer. What that means is we're integrating digital into our business every day. Our customers are adopting technology at a rate that is really mind-blowing. They want the product when they want it, how they want it, as fast as they can get it, whether it's in store, whether the moms want to come and just have their groceries, order online and have somebody come out and put it in your car. If you have 2 kids in the back, that is like a happy thing. Or if you want it just in an hour or 2, like our customers in China. That's the integration of digital and physical. Right now, we don't have great rules on digital trade. We really don't. We're just starting to think about what is the integration of the digital economy into the trade rules-based trading system. So when we look at digital trade, it's not just data. That's one element of it, but it's payments, it's trade facilitation, it's last mile delivery, it's the whole ecosystem from procurement to delivery of a product. And I don't think the rules are adequate right now to think about what's going to happen in the next 10 or 15 years as technology moves faster and faster and faster. So if anything, we want more rules-based trade. We want better rules. And so thinking about undermining those rules or pulling out US leadership could be really harmful to the business that we want to build for the future. A year ago, a number of us were at the WTO, and it was actually sort of an exciting time. I felt really good about the system because we were looking at things like TISA, ratification of the Trade Facilitation Agreement, new rules on environmental goods and services, environmental goods, and we were really thinking about how do we modernize and bring the WTO system into sort of the next generation trade agreements with TISA. How do we make sure trade facilitation, which I think actually is one of the most important agreements we've ever negotiated, because it democratizes trade. It means everybody gets to trade their goods, whether you're the smallest or the biggest, because it really does reduce that friction to allow people to truly engage in the system. And so to kind of have this reversal now to call into question the WTO, I don't know whether that makes a lot of sense for business or agriculture. And I'm not really sure where the constituency is for these views. And that's the hard thing to sort of reconcile as a global business is, what's the end game here? If we do undermine the WTO, if we do call into question rules-based trading system, what's the better system? It's sort of like Winston Churchill in Democracy. You know, it's a failure unless you look at every other system. So if you actually were to succeed in taking away rules-based trading system, then do you go back to just sort of economic nationalism, where we just use our might to tell people what we want them to do? That might have worked in the 80s when we were 25% of world trade. The United States is now only about 13% of world trade. So I'm not sure that sort of system works as well as one would have thought. And we don't trade just finished goods anymore. We trade a lot of intermediary good, and global supply chains are so interlinked that even if you were to try to do that sort of like, I'm just going to tell you what you need to do with me, country X, and go into this non-rules-based system, I think there's a lot of collateral damage that would happen to U.S. Workers, U.S. manufacturers, and U.S. farmers. And that sort of gets me to TPP, where, you know, I am thrilled that you guys are going forward. As a company, Walmart has operations in Canada, Mexico, Japan, and Chile. Those are retail operations. We source from Vietnam and Malaysia significantly. So TPP 11 is actually pretty good for Walmart. Who it's bad for, though, are U.S. manufacturers and U.S. farmers. When we saw the benefit of TPP for us in Japan as a food retailer, it was about lowering those very high tariffs on U.S. beef, where we've been doing promotions to get U.S. beef and to get U.S. beef into the Japanese market, and U.S. pork into the Japanese market. We're already selling U.S. dairy in the Japanese market. TPP 11 means that my buyers need to think about Australian dairy, Australian beef, and Canadian pork. That's not good for U.S. producers. It's not good for U.S. manufacturers. We can still hopefully deliver on our promise to help people save money to live better, but what it means is we'll be doing that outside the United States. And I think that's the real danger here in pulling ourselves off the field, is what does that do for U.S. suppliers and U.S. consumers? I worry a lot about that, because that, you know, for U.S. customers, that could be really detrimental. So I was trying to think about how to make these remarks without sounding as hysterical as I sort of feel inside, but and I think that's just, I'm a trade policy person, but I don't really understand how you go about conducting international trade without the rules. And so that's why I think it's so important to have forums like these, so that we as business people can speak up and defend the system, because I think actually that's what's going to need to happen going forward. We need to make it real to people. Talking about, you know, some of these more obscure topics on trade doesn't really get at the heart of it, but talking about opportunities lost, I think, is important to bring to the fore.
Thank you, Sarah. Karen Sack is Managing Director for Ocean Unite. Could you talk about, from your perspective, from an NGO perspective, what is the value of the World Trade Organization? And how do you think NGOs would view the WTO going forward if things like the dispute settlement system were to seize up, or if initiatives like the fisheries subsidies talks were to stall?
Well, thank you. As I've been sitting listening to this, I live in a world of ocean policy, where we have one international convention that governs how we deal with the ocean, which is kind of the constitution for the ocean, the Law of the Sea Convention. But there are very few rules that are multilateral associated with it. And the result is a system that is inequitable, unbalanced, and has definitely undermined environmental sustainability, as well as the livelihoods of billions of people around the world. And I'm flagging that because everything we do is to try and strengthen the multilateral system on oceans policy so that there is a level playing field, so that there are common rules and that everyone gets to play by them. So it's a little frightening as we listen to this discussion, and I think from the environmental community, I wouldn't hesitate to say that we have issues with the WTO and the way that it has worked and the rules that it has put in place. And we have issues with other multilateral trade agreements and the rules they have in place. But we also understand that without those rules, we would be in a far more difficult situation. So we would be very strongly in favor of strengthening rules for fairness and equity, and making sure that environmental and labor standards are strongly incorporated into those rules. And the fisheries subsidies discussions at the WTO are a case in point. There has been a discussion going on for the past 20 years on the need to get rid of fisheries subsidies that are harmful. Now, I'm actually going to step into the ocean for just a second, because I think we can talk in abstract, but it's important to know some of the facts. And I have a feeling that not many people here have their fingers on the pulse of how much money is spent on harmful fishery subsidies or the state of the ocean. So the first fact I think that's important is that about 90% of global fish stocks are either fully fished, overfished, or depleted. These are marine life that also support the livelihoods of 3 billion people around the world and provide protein, primary protein for those people. So when this system, it's a full Earth system, begins to collapse, we are going to have a serious problem. There's about $30 billion spent on harmful subsidies in the fisheries sector each year. About 2/3 of those are capacity enhancing subsidies, and it's estimated that there are about 2.5 times the number of fishing vessels currently working in the sea than there is the fish stock capacity to actually enable them to catch sustainably, 2.5 times. So we've got about 2/3 of capacity enhancing subsidy going to new boats, bigger boats, port infrastructure, and then about 1/3 of the harmful subsidies going to fuel subsidies. And these are literally fueling vessels to go out and catch fish that without those subsidies would be unprofitable. Those businesses would not function. So the opportunity in Buenos Aires next month is to actually finally get an agreement, and I think Ambassador Wolf spoke to this earlier, which would address these harmful fishing subsidies and actually begin to bring a system into place which would rebalance the way the ocean is currently fished and managed. There's a heads of state agreement, and these have actually, there have been statements that were made in 2002 at the World Summit on Sustainable Development, at the Rio +20 meeting, and then most recently in the agreement for the Sustainable Development Goals, where Goal 14 focuses on life in the ocean. Target 14.6 is focused on getting rid of harmful fishery subsidies by 2020. As of last week, there was large convergence from countries around the world, and I think the key here is this is a north-south collaboration to actually address these issues. There was agreement on the focus on marine fish species. There was convergence around a series of issues that would actually help tackle this fundamental problem. And then last week, actually, 2 countries entered into the discussions with new proposals, and they were China and the United States. The United States stepped up to the table with a proposal to expand the scope of the agreement from wild capture fisheries in the ocean to including fish that are caught through inland fisheries. Now, this is something that had been agreed the geographical, the scope of the agreement on wild caught fish would be there. I think there is uncertainty as to why the US has kind of thrown this out onto the table all of a sudden, other than it doesn't necessarily want there to be an agreement. And its focus now is on securing transparency in the agreement so that we can all understand what subsidies are out there and what needs to be done about them, rather than agreeing on the text to actually get rid of harmful fishery subsidies. China brought the subject, no one will be surprised about this, of sovereignty and territoriality. Essentially, they have taken the South China Seas to the WTO discussions, although they have said that they are open to negotiating issues on that. But I think the bottom line is there is an opportunity here. There is a lot of convergence from around the world, and we would be hopeful that the US can step back from where it is today to maybe a few months before then, and work with countries like Australia, Norway, Indonesia, the least developing countries, and actually secure an agreement that gets rid of these subsidies and begins to bring a little bit of lawfulness to the lawlessness that currently dominates the sector of the economy.
Thank you very much, Karen. I did want to step back and talk a little bit about prospects for the ministerial and follow up on some of the conversation that happened earlier on today. I also wanted to recognize the work of the government of Argentina in setting up the ministerial. They're doing a tremendous amount of work, and I think regardless of the outcomes, there are processes that they're putting in place, including this business day, that I think will be a real benefit for the World Trade Organization. So for Elizabeth, maybe you first. I just came back from Australia, as you know, and it never gets old to keep saying that. But it was heartening to hear from your colleagues in Australia about the tremendous leadership role that Australia is taking at the World Trade Organization in advance of the ministerial on things like e-commerce and transparency, fishery subsidies. And so could you talk a little bit about how you see the ministerial playing out and where do you see opportunities for outcomes or progress?
Thanks, Jake. And look, as I said in my earlier remarks, Australia does see the WTO as the bedrock of the global system that's delivered peace and prosperity. And so we're strongly supporting a successful MC11 outcome. We look forward to working with Argentina in achieving that. And we also want to achieve a forward work plan that strengthens the work of the WTO going forward into 2018 and beyond. And we found it was very heartening in the APEC leaders' statement that APEC leaders or economies committed to work with WTO members towards a successful WTO outcome. So that's very pleasing, as well as recognising a rules-based multilateral trading system, which is very important. There were a few other adjectives in there which were also important: fair, transparent, open and inclusive. That's a really positive step and provides support for the WTO going forward. Specifically on outcomes, yes, we're really driving some specific outcomes in the WTO. We see there as potential widespread interest for outcomes on, we've mentioned fisheries, but fish subsidies, e-commerce, services, domestic regulation. as well as agriculture domestic support. And just before I go into those really, really briefly, before I joined the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, I was actually a legal officer at the Law of the Sea Tribunal in Hamburg. So I actually know the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea quite well, and do agree that if we touch on that first, we really have the potential for finally, after 20 years, achieving an outcome in MC11, and Australia is strongly supportive of that. We've seen convergence, we've seen 7 proposals come together to form a compilation text. So we will be working with others to continue to try and get an outcome at MC11, because if we don't, that's really a significant opportunity that's been lost. And that goes to the broader relevance of the WTO as an organisation that is relevant into the future for its stakeholders, such as Walmart, and such as small and medium enterprises, as well as developing countries, as well as the environment. I mentioned briefly, so agricultural domestic support, this has always been a key interest. Australia is the leader of the CANS group of agricultural exporters. We would like to see a tightening of rules on domestic support. However, we recognise that the prospects for this at MC11 might be limited, so we're looking as a first step, an achievable step, at trying to set some sort of overall limits on agricultural domestic support. And there is some support for that proposal. We will continue working with others. There are other proposals along the same lines that we will try and drive forward for MC11. E-commerce, there is convergence on a rollover of the moratorium on customs duties for electronic transmissions. Not yet assured, but we think will be agreed by MC11. But I have to say on e-commerce, we have been driving discussions on e-commerce along with some others in the WTO. Unfortunately, we do not see prospects for a substantive outcome at MC11 that goes beyond the status quo. To be frank, discussions on the issue have been blocked since about 2016. In fact, I was in discussions earlier than that, which really did not seem to progress very far. So Australia, along with others, I think including the EU, have put forward a proposal to form a new working party that will address trade-related aspects of e-commerce. If we cannot achieve a multilateral outcome at MC11, our Minister has made it clear that we, Australia, will be open to other approaches, including plurilateral approaches on e-commerce. As others have said, this is a vital 21st century issue, and it's really important that WTO members step up. And I note it's a constellation, once again, of North and South, developed and developing countries. An outcome will be important for small and medium enterprises, global entrepreneurs, the like. And I've touched on fish subsidies, so thank you. I haven't touched on domestic services regulation. I just want to say one because we have been a strong proponent of this. Our proposal has currently attracted support from 51 WTO members, but there is significant pushback. However, we think the impetus is there for a multilateral outcome. Ministers will look at this at the MC11. If that can't be achieved in MC11, then we hope at least ministers will put forward a statement recognising the progress to date and on the basis of the current text committing to work going forward.
Thank you. Just getting to your statement about this being a north-south thing for e-commerce, one of the things we've had the opportunity to do through our Global Innovation Forum is work with the Friends of E-Commerce for Development in Geneva, and led by countries like Costa Rica and Pakistan and Nigeria, and to see them advocate for systems that they see as in their country's interest to help their small businesses access the global economy, I think has been really inspiring and refreshing. And I think having them join up with your and Japan's and others' leadership would be really positive for at least plurilateral prospects in the World Trade Organization. So Rufus, I want to turn to you next, and Sarah as well. I think traditionally the business community shows up at ministerials to advocate for progress on existing negotiations or to launch new negotiations. Is that the message this time? I know you are going, and I think, Sarah, you might be considering going to Buenos Aires. Or is there another message that you're going to go to Buenos Aires to try to deliver?
Well, certainly want to deliver messages consistent with what a number of speakers have said here about the importance of trying to move forward and drive a positive agenda in the WTO. Before I get to specifically answering your question, let me get back to a point Sarah made. She made the point about what are the alternatives to trying to build a better house of rules in the world. And she said, economic nationalism, is that really the direction? Made a passing comment about, that might have worked in the 1980s when we were 25% of the world economy. But the other big difference about the 1980s was the US had a very clear set of objectives in mind about how it wanted to improve the system. And this unilateralism wasn't designed to turn us inward. It was designed to try to convince the rest of the world to move in the right direction. And I would argue that as a result of the Uruguay round in the WTO system, we did move in the right direction in lots and lots of areas. Getting to your point, obviously one of the areas where the Uruguay round didn't move very effectively was in the linkages between trade and the environment, areas like labor standards and other things. A number of us have worked for a long time in the system to try to improve those areas through international negotiations. I was very involved in the negotiation of the labor and environment side agreements in the NAFTA, which, viewed now retrospectively aren't seen as adequate, but at the time they were groundbreaking efforts to create a better sense of overall fairness to the way the trading system was going. And I think clearly in an area like fisheries subsidies, this is an important test for seeing if we can continue to go forward with that. So then to get your specific question, and Jake, I would not want to miss a chance to give a nod to my own vice president and his efforts in the GIF to focus on an area like e-commerce and the digital economy. Done a tremendous amount of work in that area, working with Sarah, who chairs our WTO working group, and a number of other companies, to put an emphasis on what it is in the kind of future of the U.S. economy that is vitally concerned with how we build this international system. So if you really think about what's happening to the U.S. economy, we're now building automobiles and steel with less than a fourth the number of workers we used to per unit of output 20-some years ago. Productivity has really been a huge driver of the resurgence of an industry like autos, but it also means that from a jobs perspective, the only way the U.S. can continue to build good jobs in the U.S. is if we're getting to the 95% of the world's consumers that are outside our borders, and that if we're creating a more open global system with better rules. And there's nowhere that's more important than in the whole space of the digital economy and e-commerce. Now, what can we achieve in Buenos Aires? Obviously, it's the start of a process. The process actually has already started, like you say, but many of us recognize how long and how difficult the trail is to actually building something in the WTO system. But as I mentioned about those agreements in the Uruguay round, there's proof that if you stick to your goals and if you have consistent and clear objectives and you're seen as a leader in the system, you can achieve them over time. This is going to take a long time to do. I hope that what we can do in Buenos Aires is start to have a better understanding globally of why this actually is a win-win proposition. It's not yes, it's something that will be very beneficial to so many of the U.S. companies that are the big innovators that have created the platform. But as Sarah said, this is I think both Elizabeth and Sarah said, this is, opening up trade to all kinds of new actors. Small producers of specialty products in Asia and in Africa and other places who now have access to the platforms for trading globally. And even small and medium-sized businesses in the developed world who haven't been able to participate because of the barriers to entry. So hopefully that's part of what comes out of this. Obviously I'd like to see progress on some of the other issues that Alan mentioned, because I think at this point what we need to see is a reaffirmation of the fact that The negotiating process is working. We've made the transition successfully from kind of the disappointments of the original Doha agenda to an agenda that's forming in the system that will take time to take full shape, but let's get started somewhere.
Thank you, Rufus. Sarah, what about you, prospects for the ministerial?
Yeah, I think, I guess our perspective is, I don't know if you always have to have a big outcome at a ministerial. I think it somehow got baked in that you have to have a sort of a ta-da moment. And I think actually right now is a good time to sort of step back and to look at what is the direction of the WTO going forward? How do we do some institutional reform to make sure we're looking at the best way to take decisions? Because I wouldn't say, as big a defender as we are as the rule-based trading system, it's been hard to make multilateral progress in the WTO on a number of these issues. Now, I think the Trade Facilitation Agreement is a monumental achievement because it sort of changed this paradigm that we had gotten into with special and differential treatment, which was, I get to take a pass on the rules. I get to opt out. That means I get better development. And actually, that's not really true. If you look at the economies that have done the best over the last decade or so, they're actually the ones who've opened up their economies, who've actually joined the international trading system, have also put the right policies in behind the domestic policies to help train and educate people who might have been left behind. But what I liked about the Trade Facilitation Agreement, and do continue to like, is it said, we're all trying to get to this goal. We're all going to try to get to these commitments. We have a different level of development, and therefore, what are the tools you need to get here, as opposed to just some 10-year cliff? Tell me, what are the capacity building efforts that you need? Tell me what you can do today. Tell me what you can do tomorrow. I think it's an interesting model, and I'm interested in seeing how we move that kind of thing forward. I think some of these, this is a personal opinion, but some of these issues that have sort of popped up in the last couple months to do something on just domestic support or here or there, I'm not sure there's just been enough vetting and thought about what that actually means, nor enough constituent support for that. And what you want right now is to rebuild support for the multilateral trading system. You don't want to move the system ahead of where the constituency is. And so I would like to see, quite frankly, a ministerial that goes through without a lot of fireworks. We fully support something on fisheries subsidies. That feels really ripe. It feels like it's been negotiated for a while. You know what the shape of the table is. And from a business that sells an awful lot of seafood, we fully support this because we don't want, this is an exhaustible resource. And we're doing everything we can to support sustainability in seafood as Walmart. So we fully support that. That feels really ripe. The digital economy, getting something going and thinking about what are the right ways to do this. I'm really encouraged by the Friends of E-commerce for Development. Oftentimes in the WTO, if the US was for something, everybody else had to be against it. This is interesting, seeing countries say it's in our own interest to have better rules to make sure we can participate in the internet economy. That would be something that would be really helpful. But I'd also like to see a ministerial go through with not a lot of fireworks. Just to have a happy conclusion, I think would be a very good setup for work in the, if I'm being honest, for work in the WTO in the future.
Thank you. Karen, you touched a little bit on this in your opening remarks, but could you maybe talk a little bit more about prospects for the fishery subsidies at or after the ministerial?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the sense is that this is one of the things that could be a significant outcome for this ministerial. And I think there is certainly from, there's convergence within the negotiations. There also seems to be convergence between countries, environmental groups, businesses about the importance of this element and actually fixing a problem it's completely fixable. It's finite, it can show real change. If we really need to see what happens in the next week or so in terms of the positions that both the US and China have put forward. If there is no multilateral agreement at the WTO, I think there are definitely efforts for a plurilateral agreements to be reached. Australia has been a truly amazing advocate on combating fishery subsidies globally. There was the Global Ocean Commission, which was a group of 17 eminent people from around the world who have focused on this issue. The new the UN envoy, special envoy for oceans, who's just been appointed, will be at the ministerial trying to push this forward. So we are very hopeful that this can be done. But it really comes down to what the US position is and where the US takes the discussions. So I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens. But we definitely are hoping that if we do not get this agreement, I think that really brings into question whether countries can meet the targets within the Sustainable Development Goal for Oceans to end harmful subsidies by 2020.
Thank you. So I know the agenda says we're supposed to end at 11:45. I think so long as our panelists have time, we're going to keep it going until about noon. If there are any questions from the audience, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone and identify yourself, please. There's a microphone coming.
Thank you, Jean-François Boitin with CP Economic Think Tank in Paris. And congratulations to Ambassador Wolf and to the panelists. With an extra kudos to Sarah Thorne. I hope she can make that pitch on Fox News. That would be tremendously helpful. I have a broad question here. Do we see here, with this new administration, break with the precedent, or is it a culmination? Because it seems to me that over the past years, there has been a tendency on the part of the US to actually stay out of the WTO, be very active on TISA, precisely because it was not part of the WTO, spend a lot of capital on the TPP. And so aren't we in a position where essentially the business community and the NGOs took the WTO for granted and are now in a position to try to argue for the rule-based system after giving not enough thought about the values of that system?
I think that was addressed to the U.S. business community. So
I would take issue with the presumption that we took the system for granted, because I think a number of us have been showing up in Geneva for every year, and we're very excited about the prospects of the Doha round. I think the challenge is that when you had some inertia because of institutional issues related to being able to actually get a multilateral agreement, it's hard for businesses to say, I'm going to be here every day if nothing's happening. But you did see people show up when there was very interesting ITA2, TISA, work on digital trade, work on environmental goods. The lights were on and people were there. And so I think the issue is more that you have to show some progress, and you have to be engaged, and the business is going to go to where the movement is. I think we're in a different point now where we're calling into question whether the system is actually beneficial or not. And I think you'll see a lot of folks come out and say, wait a minute, please don't take this away because it's what we depend on. What we were trying to do was to say, what else can we move on? How do we make sure the institution is adapting and reacting to the new trade? And I think there are some, it was frustrating for the business community to see that we couldn't move forward in Doha, that there was a lot of blocking by certain economies in certain countries to progress. And that is frustrating. But if a plurilateral is going to move, I think the good news was it was being done under the architecture of the rules-based system, and TISA certainly was being done with an eye to how do we multilateralize these agreements. And so you make progress sort of 2 steps forward and then try to multilateralize. So I'm not sure it's fair to say that the business community ignored. I think the business community tried to work within the constraints to see what we could move forward. And ITA2 is certainly a monumental achievement, trade facilitation agreement as well.
If Elizabeth,
I could
sure.
just add, the US leadership was really essential in getting outcomes in Nairobi 2 years ago. So the eradication of export subsidies, agricultural export subsidies, and just driving the agenda. So I think the US was, and its leadership was ever present throughout the years, certainly that I was working at the Geneva WTO mission, Australia's mission to the WTO, and subsequently. So yes, there's been a lot on the agenda, and as Sarah said, we've looked to see, and Australia was there in those initiatives, to see where progress could be achieved if it couldn't be achieved with the entire membership, but with a core group of membership. But certainly we've retained our commitment to the WTO. I don't think it's an either or. And ultimately, as Sarah said, something like a TISA outcome could be multilateralized and go back into the system and strengthen it that way. So that was a very important outcome. Would have been if it had been finalized. And hopefully still will.
You have one in the back there.
All right, maybe one last question in the back.
My name is Justin Margolis with the government of Quebec. The question is not being talked about at MC11, but is a failure of the WTO, in my opinion, is implementation of paragraph 6 of the Doha Declaration on compulsory licensing for pharmaceutical drugs that would allow for generic pharmaceutical drugs to be made available in countries before their patents are up. Is there any talk about advancing this within the framework of intellectual property discussions, given the recent pandemic of Ebola and how pertinent public health crises are still?
I'm just the moderator.
Look, I'm not as closely involved in that. I'll have to follow up on that one.
I mean, there obviously was a huge effort over many, many years, as you know, to create an amendment and an agreement. That amendment is now, I think, I'm not sure if it's received the necessary ratifications to be in force, but I don't know that there really is a focus on this issue, because the question now is more whether countries can make use of that system and have an economic incentive to do so. I don't think it's the front burner issue for Buenos Aires at all.
All right, with that, I wanted to thank CSIS and Scott Miller in particular for hosting the conference. I want to thank the government of Argentina, Ambassador Wolf, and please join me in thanking our panelists.